Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Performal webinar on the topic of creating a performance culture in nonprofit organizations. Some of you have attended our previous webinars, and this is a part of a series on performance management topics hosted by the Performal Partners. The Performal Partners are research organizations, Urban Institute, and Children's, and performance management software social solutions. I'm Ingvild Bjørnvold, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Social Solutions. And on behalf of all of the partners, I'm very pleased to have so many of you join us today. Our webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, but because of the enormous interest, you can probably see that our webinar registration is off the charts. Our speakers have graciously agreed to stay on the webinar for an additional half hour to answer as many questions as we can. So feel free to type in your questions in the chat as Christina explained, and then we will get to them as soon as we can. We have with us two great speakers today. The first one is Isaac Castillo, who's the Senior Research Scientist at Children's, one of the Performal partners. And before Isaac joined Children's, he worked at the Latin American Youth Center in Washington, D.C., and really contributed to making that organization nationally known for its good performance management. And creating a performance culture, of course, was a big part of that. The other person we have presenting with us today is Julie Russell, who is the Deputy Director at the St. Louis County Children's Service Fund, which is working very, very hard to make sure that it invests in effective and quality mental health and substance abuse services for youth in St. Louis County. Julie has quite a bit of experience with creating a performance culture, both while working in a nonprofit and as a funder. So today we have the perspective of a funder that is dedicated to supporting effectiveness in the organizations that it funds, which is going to be a really helpful perspective to have, I think. So without further ado, I would like to welcome both of you, Isaac and Julie. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ingvild. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here and doing another webinar for Performal, and I'm really happy to be presenting with Julie Russell, who's really, really sharp and on the ball with this stuff, and I'm curious myself to see what Julie has to share about this topic. Before we get into today's content, I did want to do a couple things. I think the first thing is to really provide a bit of a review of prior webinars that have been done for Performal, and in particular, I wanted to highlight two. The first of those was one that I did on August 14th of this year, which was an introduction to performance management. And in that webinar, we talk a lot about what performance management is and some of the concepts related to performance management. There was another webinar that was done on September 20th, 2012, that talked about taking the next step toward performance management. And a woman named Teresa from the Urban Institute led that webinar that talked a little bit about getting to performance management and how to actually make that happen. Both of those webinars and all of the webinars that we have at PerformWell are archived, and you can listen to them once they're completed at any time through this link that you have up on your screen. The website does require you to register and to sign in to be able to listen to the webinars and to download the slide content. But once you've registered once, you can just use the same login information. You'll be able to view all of the webinars going forward. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about performance management itself and the concept. And I really want to cover this fairly quickly as a review to the prior webinar that we did last time to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what we mean by the concept of performance management. So the U.S. Office of Personnel Management defines performance management as the systemic process by which an agency involves its employees as individuals and members of a group in the accomplishment of agency missions and goals. Well, that's one definition of performance management. And like many things in life, many people define the same thing in different ways. And so what I wanted to offer, it was an additional definition of performance management, and one that we use through the PerformWell website, and that consists of two parts. Performance management, according to this definition, is a dynamic process designed to better understand program operations, monitor outcomes, and ultimately help nonprofits become high-performing organizations which produce positive outcomes. Now, you'll notice that there are two words on this definition that are highlighted and italicized, and that's very much intentional. We want to communicate that performance management is a dynamic, it is an ever-changing process, and it is done to help you as an organization or employees of a nonprofit understand what's going on throughout the entire organization. Performance management is also a regular, ongoing performance measurement, reporting, analysis, and program modification. So these are the things, the activities, the things that you will need to undertake to really, really make sure that you're doing performance management well. So that is a really quick review of some of the concepts we covered in the last webinar. Now that we've done that and we're on a common definition of what performance management is, I really want to talk about how do you actually get this done within an organization. And I think one of the critical parts to that is reshaping the culture of your organization. I think that's really what we want to focus on for this particular webinar. Each organization has its own culture. Each organization operates in a different way and places priorities on different things throughout the lifetime of that organization. Getting performance management ingrained into the culture of the organization is a really, really important part to the entire process, and there are many things that have to be done or thought about when we're talking about this culture change, and that's where I actually want to start. I really think that there's three larger concepts that we need to think about in terms of getting performance management to happen in an organization and making the culture change happen. So when we're thinking about these concepts, we literally are changing how the organization runs, how it operates, how it does business. You know, in many ways, an organization is not used to using data, is not used to using information in a very structured and formal way. And what we're trying to do is just reshape the culture of the organization to be more accepting of information. And so with the second point, I think really that's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's all about information and how it can be used and who should be using it. Many times in organizations, when information is presented, it may be used by one group but not another group. Managers may use information in one way, but frontline staff may not use it at all. And I think when we're talking performance management, we need to shift the culture of the organization so that, according to the third point here, information is literally seen as a valuable and necessary resource by everyone in the organization. So everyone from your frontline staff to your middle management to your executive director to your board of directors, even everyone in support positions like fundraising and accounting, all see information that you collect on the effectiveness of your programming as vital to the overall success of the organization and vital to the success of each and every individual program. Okay, but how do we actually get that done? That's really a very critical and important part, and a little bit of what I want to talk about and what I'm going to have Julie talk about a little bit later. I think the first piece of advice I can give to organizations when they're starting on this process or thinking about culture change in performance management is really literally don't rush it. Your organization was not created over a short period of time, and many organizations have been in existence for years, if not decades. And you are literally changing the culture of the organization, and that can't be done overnight or in a period of weeks. And many times you need to think about this as a multi-year process, that you will need to undertake activities and initiatives over 2, 3, 4, 5 years to ultimately change the culture and get it to a place where your organization is an effective user of information and has a true performance management culture. The second piece of advice I give to organizations who are looking to undertake this cultural change is to really start small and then sort of increase your efforts over a period of time. So when I've worked with organizations on this topic in the past, where I've seen it really fail is they try to shift the entire organizational culture for the entire organization right away within a period of weeks or even within a month. And it's just destined to fail in those instances. And it fails because it's difficult to shift the thinking of every single person within an entire organization over a short period of time. So the advice I often offer is that you really should start with a single program or a single location or a single setting or some small part of your organization to really attempt the culture change in first. And then once those people have been brought on board, or once you've shifted the culture in that unit or that location or that program, you can strategically expand to a slightly larger part of your organization or another component or part or location within your organization. There's also another advantage to this, which is by starting small and then increasing over a period of time, you develop advocates within your organization. You get people who are actually participating and doing the culture change, but then who can advocate for that culture change and can stand up within the organization and say, this is a good process, we're getting some good information, and we as an organization can benefit from it. If you try to do everyone all at the same time, it's going to be much more difficult to develop those advocates, and these internal advocates are really, really important, because it's one thing for an outsider like myself or even one or two people within the organization to try to push the importance of performance management. It's quite another when a peer or another staff person can come in and say, I really think this is an important thing that we need to do as an organization, and I can show you why it's been effective for me or why it's led to improvements in my work. So again, don't rush it and really take your time in this process. The next piece of advice or thing I often have people start to think about when trying to change the culture for performance management purposes is to really think about the staffing and the people part of this. The people part of it is such an important concept, I think, that gets overlooked, and it really is critical and central to the entire culture change process. So two larger points on this I would hope that everyone would consider. The first is that performance management culture change needs to start at both ends of the organization. So yes, and quite obviously, it needs to start with the organizational leadership, be that your executive director or chief operating officer and your board of directors. They need to be involved, they need to have buy-in, they need to be on board, and they need to understand what is going to happen when you start doing things, when you start doing performance management and what that actually looks like. But at the same time, you need to make sure that all of your frontline staff, your direct service staff, the people who actually do the work and work with your participants are also engaged in the process, and they understand the whole point of the process and what they're being asked to do. Again, I've seen instances where organizations have tried to focus just on the top or just on the bottom and try to go from that direction, either or, and it just doesn't work out. You really need to get both ends of the organization bought into this and to really get the support of both ends, because otherwise it makes it much more difficult to shift the culture of an organization. Now, I think the second main point in this is I really do think that shifting the performance management culture of any organization has to be someone's responsibility. Now, ideally in an organization, if you're big enough or you have enough resources, you make it someone's full-time job. So you hire someone or you promote someone from within and say your job, your primary job is to make sure that the performance management culture and infrastructure for our organization is up and running over a period of several years. But realistically, there are many nonprofits out there that are fairly small and don't have the resources to devote it to someone as a full-time job. Even so, that being said, in those smaller organizations, I still would advise that you should at a minimum have a written out task or a statement or put something in someone's job description to say that that person is responsible for making this culture change happen. So the third point here is literally someone needs to own it. It needs to be someone's responsibility. Again, where I've seen this fail in organizations is when people don't make it a priority or don't make it a large enough priority, or you tack it onto someone's existing workload. You tell the IT person, deal with this performance management infrastructure, or you give it to the chief operating officer, and it's one more thing on their never-ending list of things to do, and they don't own it. It's not a priority for them, and it makes it much more difficult to actually make the culture change happen. Okay. Let's talk a little bit now about, once we have sort of the staffing in place and the thinking about it in place, how do we talk about performance management within an organization? Because I think that's also a critical part that often gets overlooked. And I actually think about this in terms of marketing. So how do we market the concept of performance management internally or within your organization to make sure everyone is on board? So 3 points on this. The first is really the organization and the people within it should think of the culture change as a communications or a marketing strategy. So you literally should be thinking about this as, how can I persuade, how can I change people's minds on the concept of performance management, and I need a strategy to be able to do that, to effectively communicate to everyone within the organization. Now, inherent in this, and for anyone who's done any marketing work, I think it's really important to make sure that you develop key talking points for your staff. So these are concepts that every person on your staff should be comfortable communicating to themselves and within each other and to each other, to really focus on the critical, important parts of why performance management is being done within your organization, why you're asking your staff to do it, and what benefits you're hoping to get out of it. And the final point I think really just emphasizes that, which is, you need to, once you've developed your messages or you've developed your key talking points, you need to stay on message. And particularly the organization's leadership needs to stay on message with all of these points as to why performance management is being done and the importance of it and why it's ultimately going to benefit the organization. Again, where I've seen it fail in many instances is when the organization's leadership, be they the executive director or the chief operating officer or the board of directors, really are only paying lip service to the concept. They'll make a statement they'll try to communicate the key talking point, but then under their breath mumble that this really isn't a priority for the organization or they don't understand those concepts. All of those really just hurt the messaging of the whole concept. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of this as a marketing concept or a messaging concept to really make sure that the culture change truly and absolutely happens within every part of the organization. If the message isn't consistent, if the right people are delivering the wrong message or not delivering the message in a really emotional or emphatic way, then the message is not going to permeate throughout the entire organization. And you need it to be able to get culture change through the organization. There's an interesting question that came up from the chat from April that asks about, what are organizations actually calling this process? And she gives a bunch of different terms. And I think she's right. She gives a bunch of example terms like quality management, performance excellence, performance management. People are going to call it different things, and I think that's perfectly fine. I think what's really important is you as an organization understand and define it yourselves, and you are consistent as to what it is you're trying to achieve. Part of the reason I gave the definitions at the very beginning of this presentation is to help us have a common understanding of what we're talking about in terms of performance management. And again, part of this marketing or messaging technique I'm encouraging everyone to undertake would be to define what these terms are and what you actually mean and why you picked one term over another term and how you are conceptualizing each of those terms to actually be operationalized within your organization. So one further point on sort of this marketing and messaging concept, I think it's so important that I kind of want to emphasize it with another bit of conversation here or another slide. And I really talk about it when I talk about this with organizations or when I've done work within nonprofits to actually make this culture change happen. I literally talk about changing the conversation. So what does changing the conversation actually mean? Well, that means that you're trying to frame your questions around performance management ultimately is how can you provide better services to your participants. I think for many, many years, these concepts really aren't new, right? When we're talking about collecting information and using information to make programmatic improvements, organizations, nonprofits have been collecting information for years, decades oftentimes. I think the critical part of this now, the critical part of this time that we are at now is trying to get people to understand that for the culture change to truly happen, you need to get at the appropriate reason why you're collecting this information and why you're putting all of this work into it. And that should be so that you're providing better services to your participants. It's not about satisfying funders. It's not necessarily about getting more money in the door. It's to better serve the people that do come through your doors and that access your services and making sure that you can serve them better tomorrow than you're currently serving them today. Now, sometimes that means that you have to talk about or think about specific words or terms as part of this conversation. So many times I've heard people kind of look at the term data as a negative thing. And part of your role in changing the conversation or making sure the culture change happens is to actually reframe the concept of data as a positive and useful thing and not necessarily negative or judgmental. And part of how you can do that is to actually use different words if they're necessary. Many times people have a negative reaction to terms like data or evaluation or measurement. There's something inherent in, I think, a lot of human beings when you hear those terms that they're just very negative concepts. If that's true in your organization or even if you feel that way personally, then sometimes you might want to use different words. And so I've encouraged organizations to use words just like information instead of data. Information tends to be a little bit less neutral and a little safer term than something like data. I encourage you again to think about really which particular words you use because those words can have such a big effect of how this whole conversation is heard and really internalized by staff. And I think finally and most importantly, as part of your talking points, you should really be communicating a single message and a single purpose for collecting this information and measuring it and putting the work into it. And that really is that so you can better serve your participants, so you can better serve your clients. And I think I've seen it do wonders by just changing the way you look at this process, by changing the way the thinking around why you collect this information and shifting it from a funding requirement or necessity to satisfy external people to we collect information now to be able to better serve our participants, to better serve our clients. Even switching that thinking in of itself and that approach to the data collection, it does a huge first step in actually making sure that the culture change happens. So one more set of sort of larger talking points about the culture change, and then I want to bring Julie in to give her take on this, is in so many instances when I've worked with organizations on this concept and doing the culture change, there are a lot of really good and rich criticisms and concerns that the staff have and really good talking points that they need to work through before they're honestly convinced that this is the right thing to do. And in many instances, I think organizations, their first reaction is to sort of just, to act negatively to those concerns, to either blow them off or to just say, you're not on board and you need to get on board. And I actually think that's the last thing you want to do. What you want to do is to actually address those concerns truthfully and to give some explanations to overcome any of these fears or concerns that the staff might have. And this, again, is the way to actually get true, long-lasting culture change. So I have 3 of the most common concerns I've had expressed to me, either in my own work or working with other organizations. And I want to talk through what some of those answers may look like. So the first I get, and by far the most common, is we simply don't have enough time to do performance management or deal with all the data collection and everything that has to do with performance management. And oftentimes you'll get it in the form of, I would rather serve one additional participant than have to do this data entry or do this data collection that I need to do for performance management purposes. Now, I think the truthful answer, a response to this concern is it really is dependent on the organization's sort of culture and how they're going to approach this going forward. So in the past, I've seen organizations respond to this by saying, we're going to reduce your caseload and increase the amount of time that you're going to have to be able to do data entry or to do performance management because we view it as such an important thing. Other ways I've seen it addressed is by organizations coming out and making a statement that we would rather you do data collection and performance management work and serve one less participant than the other way around, to really emphasize how important it is to the organization. Now, obviously, the organization needs to stick to that. They need to be able to address some of these time concerns in a very realistic way, but I think it is important to address these concerns when they do come up and to not just blow them off. The second concern that we frequently get is we as an organization or as a program or even as an individual staff person do not have enough resources to do performance management. And again, I think this is a very legitimate concern that an organization needs to think about how to address truthfully and how to potentially divvy up resources or reallocate resources to be able to make sure that it gets done. This may mean that the executive director doesn't get the fancy new computer that he or she wanted, and that computer then needs to go to someone else to make sure that the data collection and data analysis procedures are in place and there's enough technology to support those things. It's all about resource allocation, and really the way that you can address this truthfully as an organization is to really look at your resources in depth and really take a stand and say, we're going to put more resources to doing performance management to support our staff people to make sure that it gets done. And again, that is a big thing to shifting the culture on a larger scale. And the final comment I get a lot is, we as an organization or my staff don't have the expertise or skills to do performance management. We can't, we're not trained in survey design. We don't know how to analyze the information once we get it. And again, I think this is a very valid and accurate concern in many ways, but I don't want that to be an excuse for people. And so when I get presented with this sort of concern or really what people feel is a limitation, the advice I give to them is to really think about how they deal with similar situations throughout their organization. So the most common examples I give are that accounting and fundraising work and dealing with finances is really not necessarily an easy thing to do. It's quite difficult for many people. The same thing with fundraising or writing grants or writing proposals. That can be very difficult for people. But organizations prioritize those things and devote resources to those things and hire people who have those skill sets to be able to do them on a very consistent and a very high level. So I think, again, it comes back to, if you really are feeling this way or if your organization feels this way, how can you get expertise or skills or devote resources to be able to get this work done, similar to what you do in terms of your accounting and finance work and to your proposal or grant writing work. So hopefully I've given all of you some very usable tips and some bigger picture things to think about. But I've talked very much in the abstract. I've talked very much big picture. And what I wanted to do now is to bring Julie Russell into the conversation, because I want you to hear about someone who's actually done this work, who's actually shifted the culture of an organization from inside at multiple different organizations, and just have her present her framework and her thinking behind how she actually got this done. So Julie, I'm going to pass the ball over to you, and you've got control of the slides.
Okay, great. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I just want to thank you guys for being here. Really is a pleasure to be here with everybody. So what I would like to do is just to kind of echo and piggyback on some of the things that Isaac has already shared with you, as well as provide some practical strategies and examples that have been effective for me and my organizations as we try to transform our culture into one that's more quality and performance-based. And like many of you, you know, as a service provider as well as a funder, have been challenged with trying to create a performance culture. And about 10 years ago, as a service provider, as we were researching, you know, how do we approach this in a systematic way? You know, how do we transform our culture in a systematic and systemic way? And so as we did our research, we discovered the Malcolm Baldrige criteria for performance excellence. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about that, but that's the model that I've used probably for the past 10 to 15 years to help transform the organizations that I've been in into one that's been more focused on quality and performance. So if you're not aware of the Malcolm Baldrige criteria, it was established in 1987 by Congress to promote quality within American organizations, and then also to help those organizations compete more globally. It is currently considered the highest standard of quality in the nation, and so for us, you know, we want the best for our children and our families, and so that was a no-brainer. You know, if we could benchmark ourselves against the highest quality in the nation, then that's what we were going to do, because that's what our families and children deserved. It's also a very comprehensive framework for quality improvement, and it provides a systematic and systemic way to achieve outcomes and results. And I'm going to go into the criteria at a very high level, but then share with you some of the practical strategies that we've used within each of those areas. And also the Baldrige model really helps you to answer a couple of things. Is your nonprofit doing as well as it could? And how do you know that? And what and should your nonprofit do to improve or change? So as we go through the criteria, I'm just going to, here's the criteria here. It's a systems perspective, as I mentioned. I will go through each of them, but I just want you to think about how all of this is linked together. So your leadership, which is category 1, links with your strategic planning, which links with your customer and market focus or your client focus, links with your measurement analysis and knowledge management, your workforce focus, your processes, and ultimately your results and your outcomes. And, you know, as Isaac alluded to, you know, you can't do one thing in isolation and not look at the effect that it will have on your entire organization. And so as you're making those changes, as Isaac mentioned, you want to do them, you want to take baby steps. You know, you don't want to do it all at once. And the Malcolm Baldrige criteria, you can just take one criteria at a time and work on different things slowly and work your way up. The criteria also provides kind of a mini self-assessment that you can do to really help you determine, you know, what are your next steps going to be. So I'm going to go into each of the criteria and just briefly at a high level tell you what that criteria looks at and then some of the things that we have done. So when you look at category 1 is leadership. And really you want to ask yourself, how do our senior leaders create a sustainable, high-performing nonprofit? How do they create a sustainable, high-performing nonprofit? And so some of the strategies that we have used really is because the senior leaders, you're setting the tone within your organization, is to create an environment and a climate of learning where it's okay to make mistakes. And it's not about blame, because many times in organizations, when there are mistakes or errors, it's who are we going to blame? And as senior leaders, your job is to really, as Isaac mentioned, changing the conversation into one is how can we learn from this? How can we get better? How can we improve the care for our clients, for our families, the children that we serve? It's also the job of the senior leaders to really develop that strategic direction within your organization and to ensure that the whole system is aligned. One of the things that we do here at the Children's Service Fund and what we've done in other organizations that I've been with is to really make that mission and vision and values of your organization visible. So we have it on everybody's desk, we have it in all of our rooms, we have it in the hallways to really help anyone who comes into our building and to help our employees stay focused on the mission and vision and values of our organization. And then lastly here, really communicating clear expectations to your workforce is critical for senior leaders. And when we communicate performance management to our workforce, we don't say, it's an add-on to your work. It's really the way that we do our work. And the purpose really is to deliver that to better care for our clients.
Julie, can I jump in and ask a quick question here? Can you give an example of how you would talk about some of this information in a non-punitive or non-threatening way?
Sure. We, at our weekly staff meetings, we do what's called a plus delta. It's on our weekly agendas, something y'all might want to think about. So whenever we have a big event or big activity that we've just gone through, we do what's called a plus delta, where we go through the positives, the strengths of what occurred, and then what are the opportunities of what occurred. And, we can always get better and we can always improve. And so staff are free to talk about, some of the mistakes and some of the opportunities to improve upon what we did. And then we take it through a PDCA cycle, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But that's just part of our weekly agenda, is to talk about positives and opportunities.
Good. Thanks, Julie.
So now we're going to go to category 2, which is strategic planning. And something, again, this can be sort of a mini self-assessment that you do, is to ask yourself, how do we as an organization develop, not just to develop and deploy our strategic goals, objectives, action plans, and measures. Some of the things that we've done at the Children's Service Fund is really understanding what are our core competencies and what are we best at. What are our areas of expertise? And as a service provider, like maybe many of you, we would get into that mission creep where we would go after grants that really weren't within our realm of expertise, but we could use the dollars. So really honing in and being very clear about, what are we best at? What is the target population that we're really best at working with? And then understanding what are our strategic advantages and what were our strategic disadvantages. As a service provider, when we looked at our advantages, one of the advantages we had was a very skilled and seasoned workforce. We had clinicians who were exceptional clinicians. But when we looked at our disadvantages, one of the biggest disadvantages we had was not being able to collect that real-time data. We were doing everything on paper. And when it came time for reporting to our board, for our funders, it would take weeks, if not months, to collect that information. And so one of our disadvantages was not having a system to be able to collect that real-time data for decision making. And so one of the strategic objectives that came out of that planning session was to get a web-based system. We ended up purchasing ETO as when I was on the service provider end, and now as a funder, we're also using that same system. And it's made just a world of difference for us in being able to track real-time data, just to have that data right at your fingertips so that it's usable and you can act on it quickly. One of the other things that we've done, strategies in the strategic planning area, was to really involve all of the staff in the strategic planning process and in the development of our theory of change. One of the things that we did here at the Children's Service Fund when we started, we're a brand new organization. We spent 4 intensive days with David Hunter, just really honing in on our mission, our strategic objectives, our goals, our measures, and what our plan was going to be for the next 3 years. And all of our staff were involved in that, and that was really important because then you get the buy-in of all staff at all levels into your theory of change and really buying into the performance management structure of that. So as we go to Category 3 is customer focus. And what this looks at, and something you want to ask yourselves, is how do we listen to the voice of our clients that enhance their satisfaction and engagement with our services? So something that we do here at the Children's Service Fund and as a service provider, and Isaac mentioned this as well, is just to remind everybody that, we are in the business of improving lives, and to really hone in on that and focus on, the passion that your workforce has. So we know people aren't in social services, they're not driven by money, they're driven by really improving lives for people. And so if you can leverage that, as Isaac suggested, and saying, this data, this information is really going to be able to show how we're doing and to be able to show you how you're doing and all the good work that is being done.
Julie, I just want to jump in really quickly and say that we're getting some really good questions through the chat, and I think some of these I'm intentionally saving to the end so that we can have a little bit more richer conversation. But keep going, keep going.
Okay. I'll get through this, and I'm seeing the questions pop up. So, so when we look at Category 4 of the criteria looks at your measurement and knowledge management. And something you want to ask yourself is, how do we measure, analyze, review, and improve our performance through the use of data? And as I mentioned before, for us, what really helped to transform our processes and our culture was investing in a robust system to collect real-time data for decision making. We also regularly check the system for integrity of data. And the third thing that we've done is to really leverage the websites such as PerformWell and Child Trends to look for evidence-based practices, outcome measurements, indicators, things like that, in order to determine what next steps we needed to take. So
Julie, can I make a quick comment or question there? So I think many times people believe that getting a electronic system or a data system in place is the solution. It is the big thing that they need to do in terms of performance management. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of thinking?
Yeah, it's the system was just a tool. It was really just a tool. It wasn't the answer to everything. It definitely made things much easier and things go more smoothly, giving us that real-time data for decision making. But it was really only a tool to help us get there.
And I totally agree. I think very much this is a people problem. It is a skill problem. It is the last thing it is a software problem. The software or the electronic part of it is really just a tool to make a lot of this other work easier, right? And so the example I often give is just because someone has Microsoft Word or a word processing program, it doesn't automatically make them a good writer. You have to build up the skill set, and the tool is really the technology that helps you do it even better.
Exactly, exactly. So as we look at Category 5, this is the workforce focus, and Isaac touched upon this, upon their concerns earlier. And what you want to ask yourself here is, how do we build an effective workforce to achieve high performance? And so some of the things that we've done is really, from the beginning, is include key performance expectations into our recruitment practices. So as we're interviewing, we're looking for folks who have this passion, this expertise, this experience with data and performance, carving it into job descriptions, as Isaac mentioned, as well as performance reviews and holding folks accountable, while at the same time really providing the support to your workforce through trainings, ongoing trainings, as well as refreshers, and then taking their feedback to improve the curriculum of the training that you're providing. And then lastly here is, we've recognized and rewarded positive results. So we highlight employees in newsletters. The CEO sends out congratulations and thank you notes in recognizing staff who have really embraced the culture change, as well as produced positive outcomes and results for the children and youth. And then as we go into Category 6, Category 6 is process management, and this is kind of where everything happens. And here you want to ask yourself, how do we design, manage, and improve our key work processes? And it's really important to clearly define and map out your processes. So whether it's through flow charts, checklists, right now we just got our subscription to Visio, the Visio software, to be able to really map out and drill down into some of our key processes here at the Children's Service Fund. And then utilizing a standardized process improvement framework, which for us we use the PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. So as I mentioned at our weekly staff meetings, we conduct a plus delta, and then we go through the PDCA where we look at action items and we determine who's responsible, and we come up with deadlines. And then lastly here, Category 7 really looks at your results. And here you want to ask yourself, what are our results for our key areas? So you want to look at your service delivery results, your customer results, your workforce results, your leadership, and your financial results. And here what we've done is we have developed a balanced scorecard for our organization so that we can determine what our key critical success factors are going to be, determining what our thresholds are, and then looking at the levels, trends, and goals and some comparative benchmarks. And as Isaac mentioned, it's really important to make that data accessible and usable for staff at all levels. And I would even say, for clients, I know when I was doing direct practice and we had ETO, I was able to pull up reports out of the system and sit with my clients and talk about, how are you doing? And we're able to pull up a graph of some of their outcome measures. And then we could see, well, why is this lower here? And we could, dialogue about, well, what could we do to help you in these areas and to help you with these goals? So even at that client level, being able to share and use that data to improve the relationship as well as their outcomes. Okay.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Julie. I think that's some really good practical advice. There's one or a couple related really interesting questions that I actually would like to hear you talk a little bit about before I sort of give my last little part of the webinar. And I think those questions center around your experience both as a nonprofit direct service provider, but also working within an intermediary or a funding organization as well. And I think the questions are really focused on, if you are a funding organization, how can you assure that performance management is going to get done by the organizations that you fund? Like, what steps can you take to make sure that it happens?
Sure. So our actual application for funding is based off of the Baldrige criteria. You can Google Malcolm Baldrige and you can get the full nonprofit criteria. It's the little booklet. And so what we've done is we have taken the criteria, we've simplified it, and our application is actually based off of that. We have a measurement tool, which we call the performance assessment tool, that we use to score the applications. And then twice a year, we go in and we review records of the agencies for the clients that we fund. So we use a purchase of service model, and we randomly sample records. And when we contract for certain outcomes, and agencies let us know what measurement tools they want to use. And so as we go through the files, we're looking to ensure that those tools are implemented, that service delivery is being improved as a result of the data that they're collecting. And I want you to know too that it's in a very non-punitive way, and I hope our agencies feel that way. But when we go in, it's really about how are we going to improve services for clients. It's not a gotcha. It's really in the spirit of we're all in this together. How can we better improve the quality of what's being delivered? We also, there was a recent report that came out through Center for Effective Philanthropy, a new research survey that they had done of service providers, just asking them about the importance of performance management and do they get enough support from funders about it. And of course, a lot of them said, no, we do think it's important, but we don't get enough support for that. And at the Children's Service Fund, we pay for overhead, so we pay for data and performance management positions within organizations, and then we provide capacity building throughout the year. And so we do some very big events, some smaller learning work groups to really help our providers, really take it to the next level, provide them with practical tools and information.
Great. I think that's a great answer, Julie. And if anyone has any follow-up questions on that, the both of us, I think, would be happy to follow up on that a little bit after during the question and answer session of the program. Julie, if you can pass me back the presenter ball, I want to walk through the remainder of the webinar. And I think what I kind of want to wrap things up with really is to focus on what does it actually look like, or how do you actually know if your organization then has achieved the culture change? So we've talked a lot about how to do it, but not really a lot of what it actually looks like once the culture change has happened. And I want to walk through an example to sort of show what a performance management, an organization with a high performance management culture would look like and how they would respond to a certain set of information or data. So I want to quickly run through that, and then we'll take and go through the remainder of the questions that we have. So I want us to think about an after-school program, and so this is the example I have up on the screen now, that they are seeking to measure an after-school environment to determine where improvements can be made. And what we mean by after-school environment is, are the teachers or the instructors interacting well or effectively with the children or the students in the after-school program? Do the students enjoy being there? Do they feel it's a safe space for them? Those are the kind of things that we're trying to determine. Now, how can we do that? Well, if we actually look on PerformWell, if we were to go to the performwell.org site and actually search for after-school environment scale, we'll find an actual tool, an actual instrument that can be used. It can be handed out to students of after-school programs or participants in after-school programs to measure their impressions in the environment. So I have an example of the first 5 questions of this tool that I have up on the screen. And what I really want to do for this particular example is to have people focus on question number 2 and on question number 5. So keep in mind that this is something that has been handed out to students during an after-school program, and we're getting their responses on a scale from never to sometimes to most of the time to always. And in particular, we're going to focus on question 2, I trust the teachers here, and on question 5, I wish I was anywhere but here. Okay. So let's say we did that, and let's say the program got the results back and their information back, and they found two really kind of important points or really observations from this. The first is for question 2, which was, I trust the teachers here. 35% of the students responded with never. They never trust the teachers, and 2% responded with always. So there's a very big difference between the high end and the low end of the scale, and it's trending more towards the lower end. So there's a certain distrust of teachers here. That's the first observation based on the data. The second nugget of data is for question number 5, I wish I was anywhere but here. 80% of the youth, or 8 out of 10 of the youth, on average, responded with either most of the time or always they wish they were anywhere else but this after-school program. So we have two very important pieces of information that send signals to this nonprofit, to this program, that there might be particular issues with how the students are perceiving the environment of the program. Now, it's easy enough to be able to collect this information. You have a tool through PerformWell, you can administer it to students, you collect the information, and you look at the responses, and you can see how those responses are playing out. It's quite another thing, though, than to actually do something or respond to the information. And I think this is the critical part where you determine if your organization has shifted its culture to performance management, because I think any organization can do the previous steps. They can administer the survey, they can collect the information and analyze it and look at it. This particular step, the content on this slide is when you know that you have shifted the culture. And I think there's 3 steps to this. The first is you start asking really intensive questions, and you ask why these conditions are occurring. Why do students feel like they would rather be somewhere else? Why is there a distrust to these teachers? And to start walking through what those causes may be. Are there certain teachers that have negative attitudes? Are there certain teachers that have more experience than others? Are some of the teachers, was there turnover and they cycled in or out or during the programmatic year? You should ask these why questions, and you should be looking for some of these reasons and to walk through the legitimacy of these reasons and to understand whether or not those are truly the things that are causing it. And once you have a theory as to why things might be causing these nuggets of data that you're getting back, you should then start taking concrete steps to remedy these situations or to change something to improve the responses. So if there is a feeling that the students don't want to be there, it's finding out the reason why they don't want to be there. Perhaps they're not having fun. It's not an engaged activity for them. Perhaps it's occurring in an environment that they don't feel that is safe or that is a very nice environment. It's just very dark or dank and they simply don't like it there. Then you need to be able to respond and say, we're going to change something based on our theories and based on what the data has shown to be able to make things better for our students and to flip or to change the responses. Then, after you've made the change and after you've run the program, an organization that's truly shifted their culture will then be giving the same survey, the same instrument after the next time the program runs to see if there's been any change in your results. So what you're doing, hopefully, is measuring or collecting more information after you've made those changes, which are based on your theories as to what's gone wrong, and seeing whether or not things have gotten better, if they've stayed the same, or if they've potentially gotten worse. And I think an organization that has truly shifted their culture, that is truly embracing performance management, is going to ultimately take these 3 steps. They're going to ask why, they're going to develop reasonings as to why things have happened and responses to those things. They're actually going to take concrete steps to actually make the changes happen, and then they're going to continually assess and reassess to see if the situation is improved or changed in any way. And I think that's, if your organization is doing those things consistently over a period of time, that's when you can say, I think that your culture changes ultimately happens. I want to thank everyone for being on the webinar. I have my direct contact information up here. Julie is available, and I am available now going forward for any questions that you may have. And I'm going to quickly turn things over to Ingvild just to do a few more things before we wrap up and to get to the question and answer session.
Great, thank you, Isaac. And I actually want to ask you a very quick question, which is one of the last ones we got that has to do with the survey that you just looked at in PerformWell. So that question is from somebody who asks about trust being very subjective and being concerned that this survey, how the survey was constructed. So can you speak a little bit to why it is sometimes meaningful to use surveys that ask questions where the answers will be subjective?
Well, I mean, I think that there's two parts to that. I think that the first would be that the surveys that are on PerformWell have been tested in a variety of ways. There's been cognitive testing, which means do the people understand what these concepts are, and are they consistently giving the same responses? And so I think that you know it's important to know that you want to use instruments that have been tested for populations and who understand what these concepts are, and they're consistent in their understanding. Now, you're right that trust as a concept and a term is subjective, and there are different interpretations as to what trust means, and one child may conceptualize of trust as a different way than another child, but it's still important to ask these questions and to get this kind of information because you want to know what's happening. And there's never going to be an absolute, perfectly well-written survey instrument where everyone is going to look at every single question and answer and be spot on and have exactly the same interpretation or understanding of what those concepts are. What you want to do, though, is be able to use things that are fairly consistent and when you get some basic or common understanding of some of these terms, and then use that to figure out generally what's going on with your programming. So I think what's important to communicate here is what we're talking about is you're ultimately trying to prove or to determine, not to prove, but to determine how effective your organization is on moving the needle on any of the concepts that you identify or any of the outcomes that you identify as important. You're not necessarily in the realm or in the space currently, most nonprofits are producing information or results or evaluation material that is ultimately publishable. Maybe you get to that down the road, and that's when you start thinking about the concept of trust and unpacking it and what it means and potentially developing 10 questions instead of one question that talk about trust. But most nonprofits are never going to get there. What you really need and what you really want is just information that you can actually use to prove or to help you understand whether or not your programming is effective or not.
Okay, and we have a lot of other questions that we're going to get to, but before we do that, I just wanted to let everybody know that the next two webinars we have coming up, the next one is December 11th. That is about managing performance in youth civic engagement programs. So that is when we are launching new content on PerformWell. And that's going to be Teresa Derrick Mills from Urban Institute, and who's going to be hosting that, and she's going to be joined by Zeynep Kakli from the United Teen Equality Center. And then we have the next webinar that Isaac will be hosting is going to be on February 7th, Making Performance Management Happen. And the registration is available on performwell.org, so you can go there and sign up right now if you want to make sure that you don't miss the next webinar with Isaac, where he will be joined by Leah Galvin from the Omni Institute. So those are our next upcoming webinars, and let's go over to the questions. We have quite a few questions here, and I'd like to start with several people have asked about additional information and resources, and one person asked in the beginning specifically about where to find additional information and resources on developing these marketing and messaging strategies that you talked about, Isaac.
Yeah, and I think what's difficult is I don't think very many people have written or developed these resources specifically for marketing within or internally for a nonprofit. And I think what generally you'd want to do is to, if you're looking for help on that or just general good practices, is to look at some basic introductory marketing or advertising literature, or even how you as a nonprofit can communicate what you do to outsiders, and use those as lessons to be able to develop your sort of internal marketing plan within your organization. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is, I mean, to really sit down and think about when you've been good or when you've been effective at communicating messages to your staff over any number of issues, and to sort of utilize those same methods. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give people is you find out within your organizations who are the well-respected people, who are the people that are listened to, and that's not necessarily your executive directors or chief operating officer. It could be a frontline staff that's been there for 10 or 20 years. You sort of will know who has the credibility within your organization, and if you can get them to help deliver the message, that also makes a big difference.
Okay, great. And we have a question about the position. sort of dealing with the culture change that you were talking about, having somebody responsible. So the question is, what positions do folks responsible for performance management typically hold, and what are their titles, and what level at the organization do they have? And then another part of the question, do you have any sample language of what's effective language for including performance management explicitly in job descriptions and task duty descriptions? And I just wanted to mention that I sent out to everyone the link to one publication from Bridgespan that actually had some good information about finding the right measurement director. So that's one thing to look at. But Isaac, would you like to speak a little bit to your experience with this?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about a single position, or if you can actually fund a full-time position to be able to do this sort of work, it usually helps to have someone in the organization that is at a fairly senior level. So when speaking personally, when I had this position within an organization in the past, I was at the same level as our chief financial officer and our director of development and fundraising. So obviously, the more senior position you have, the more kind of credibility and gravitas you have in the organization to be able to make this stuff done. That being said, I've also seen it done as sort of a middle management position as well, but it's a middle management position that has some credibility, or it's someone who's been in the organization for a while who does carry that sort of institutional weight and knowledge and level of respect across the entire organization. I think where it is destined to fail is if you make it a lower level staff person, because not only are you kind of physically and visually sending a message that it's not as important as other things, but it also makes it difficult for that person to stand up and say, I need these resources, or I need this commitment from senior level people to make this kind of thing happen. So I think that there's a visual part of this, of the messaging of it, of making sure that you have a person at the right level in the organization to emphasize the importance of it. Now, as far as titles, I think that very much is sort of open. I mean, I think that there are any number of examples of titles that you could use. I mean, I've heard Director of Quality Assurance. My title was Director of Learning and Evaluation. Julie, what was your title in the past?
Director of Quality.
Director of Quality. I've heard Director of Performance Management, of Outcomes Measurement. I think it really just depends on the organization.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have a question for Julie, I think. This person is asking about a good tool for assessing organizational performance management capacity or readiness, ideally at multiple points in time. And I know you talked about the performance assessment tool. Is that something that would apply?
Sure. We actually, I believe we have it on our website, on our publications page. And it's really just the Baldrige criteria that has been simplified and condensed, but it looks at all aspects of your organization. And on the Baldrige website, Ingvild, I noticed you put that on there as well. On the Baldrige website, they do have some additional mini self-assessments that you can take. And just another thing I wanted to mention too is a workshop that my colleague Kate Tansey did I guess a few months back, Ingvild. I'm assuming it's in the repository there, but she did a really great workshop on change and transition management. And in that, she talked about, readiness for change and some of the tools and instruments that she's used to gauge that. So I think
that recording is available on the Social Solutions website, so that's socialsolutions.com, and if you go to the webinars archive, you will be able to find that workshop by Kate Tansey, which, it has a lot of information that really supplements what has been discussed today, I think. Okay, let's take a look at the other questions we have here. So could Isaac elaborate on his suggestion for how to address the concern about insufficient experience skills? And Isaac, you had mentioned something about hiring someone with those skills and training them. That could be part of the solution. But are there other strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it sort of depends on where you're going with this in the organization and who you have in-house. So you certainly, if you think that you have someone who has the right attitudes for this but not have essentially the skill sets, then you potentially could identify areas of training or instructional classes for them and have them go out and get that education and get that training and to be able to have essentially an in-house person to be able to do it. You then also, if you don't really think you have someone with the right attitude or the right basic skills and knowledge or approach to this, you also could then go and try to hire someone externally. And so I think that, Julie and I are examples of previously where organizations have identified that this was an important position they wanted funded. They advertised for the position, and we applied for them and brought our skill set to that. There are plenty of people who have been sort of formally trained in survey design or evaluation or data collection or data systems who don't want to exist in the pure evaluation and research world and would much rather go and work within a nonprofit organization and bring that skill set to the nonprofit. So those people are increasingly out there. I'd say 10 years ago they weren't necessarily, but I think that there's a new generation of people who are learning evaluation and research and survey and data collection skills who really do want to work within a nonprofit, because I think that there's such a personal reward to be able to do this work at a level where you can see change happen on a very, daily basis in working in that stuff. So I think it's all about potentially, marketing it and identifying who you want in terms of a skill set to fill those positions and trying to make those hires. But again, if you have someone in-house you think might be good for it, or you think has the right attitude or approach or even the right thinking, and when I say thinking, it's really about finding a person who is open to using data and information and who won't be looking at it as a judgmental process, but rather they like information to be able to inform the decisions that they make and that other people make. If you have someone with that attitude and spirit, it might even be a better thing to, instead of hiring someone externally, to have that person trained and built up and to learn some of these other skills they might not have, because then you have someone who already knows your organization well.
And I would like to say too that some of the best professional development that I've received in this area was through the Malcolm Baldrige program. They have the Malcolm Baldrige program has an award process, and so in order to determine who wins the award every year, they train a set of examiners to go out and conduct site visits of the organizations that have applied, and so you get a really in-depth knowledge of the criteria and then applying it to the organization that you're evaluating, and then taking that knowledge to your own organization and saying, well, how are we doing these things? And then being able to learn some best practices from those organizations. So, I have my MSW, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and it's all kind of self-taught. I didn't take any courses in graduate school, even in performance management, which I think there should be. You have evaluation courses, but not necessarily the practical performance management information.
Great, thank you both. And we have one question that is asked quite frequently from frontline staff who attend these webinars. And this person is asking, if you're not an organizational leader, how do you spark this from the front line? I'm assuming that references to this changed culture and the performance culture. And is it possible to do that if you're not in a leadership position?
So I'm glad you grabbed that question, Ingvild, because I saw when Holly asked that question, it was one I think it was really important and one that I think we needed to talk about. Julie, do you want to jump in on that, or do you want me to get started?
You get started.
So I think in this particular instance, when you're a frontline staff person and you think this is important and you want to sort of get the culture change started within the organization, you really need to start to try to persuade the leadership in your organization the importance of why you should be doing this. And I think you have to take several tactics. I think the first tactic is to really talk about why it would be important to serve your participants better. And again, you kind of do that sort of appeal to your ED and to your leadership and say, we think we have an idea of that we're doing things that are going well and that we think we're doing okay by our participants, but we don't really know for sure, and it would probably be a good idea to find out exactly where we're doing well and where we're not doing so well, all within the spirit of trying to make changes or make improvements to your programming. And oftentimes that will get the EDs or the leadership to really start thinking a little bit differently about the stuff and the importance of it. Now, the second way you can go and approach this, and I think it's not either or, I think they're both good tactics, is to talk about the importance of doing it in terms of today's funding environment and how funding is going to become even increasingly more difficult every year for nonprofits to obtain. The way you give yourself a competitive advantage, the way you can kind of better position yourself versus another nonprofit organization is to be able to prove the effectiveness of your work and to be able to say, we know we're getting good outcomes for this particular population, and more importantly, to be able to identify where you're not getting good outcomes and recognize that you need to make changes in those instances, to changes to those services to make sure you get good outcomes in the future. Both of those will be very persuasive and powerful messages for an organizational leadership to hear. You got to do it so you can better serve your clients, and you got to do it so that when funding becomes more and more difficult to raise in future years, you are placing yourself at a competitive advantage compared to other nonprofits, because you can actually show and demonstrate what good outcomes you're getting, and in instances where you're not getting good outcomes, you know what you need to do to be able to change things so you will get good outcomes in the future.
Exactly. I would echo what Isaac said. I think it's the two areas there, improving the care for your clients, but also, you know, as a funder, we want to fund organizations where we're going to get the best results. You know, what's going to be the best return on investment for us? And so if you can demonstrate your results and outcomes, or at least have that culture of learning and having your systematic processes in place, that's much more appealing to a funder. And that I think that message of sustainability can really help your messaging with the senior leaders of your organization.
Okay. And then we had a couple of people who asked about the software that you use, and I did respond to that in the chat, that Julie uses ETO software, which is the performance management software of Social Solutions, where I'm from and one of the 3 Perform Well partners. So I guess anyone who wants information about that can go to socialsolutions.com. Is there anything you'd like to say about that, Julie?
You know, as a service provider, we looked around a lot of different products, and at the end of the day, we chose ETO because it was web-based, it was flexible, it was solid, it has an excellent reputation. It's, I think, one of the best products on the market. We were able to do everything from collecting demographics to tracking outcomes to doing all of our clinical notes in the system, being able to run reports with a few clicks. It was just a very robust software. Oh, and the reporting functionality is awesome. So when I moved to becoming a funder, I actually initially hadn't really thought about using ETO because I really kind of thought it was more for service providers. But as we were looking around at different products, we were able to find grant-making software, but not grant-making software that had a performance management component. And so what we were able to do was tweak ETO, really use the core, but then kind of tweak it so that we were able to go live this fall with our entire application process in the system. We do all of our what we call our contact notes, our point of service notes in the system when we have contacts with our agencies. We just did our demographic and outcomes report in the system. And then we have all of our grant dollars and the board decisions in the system. So we went live this fall, and it went really smoothly, and we're just really grateful.
If I could jump in here.
Just the other thing, the exciting thing too is what we're going to be creating are dashboards for all of our agencies so that when they log into the system, they will be able to see what their awarded amounts are and how they're eating down their dollars, so they'll be able to look at their performance as they log into the system with a dashboard. So that's sort of our next step, and it's really exciting. So, sorry, Isaac, go ahead.
No, all I was going to add is, and I joked about this a little bit earlier, but I do want to emphasize it again because I really do think it's important that the system that you choose, whatever system it is, they all have their strengths and their weaknesses. Whatever system you end up using or whatever technology you end up using, that's just part of your process. And when we're talking culture change, it really is the people that you think you need to address. I've seen several dozen organizations that buy a software package and think that is magically going to answer all their problems and make them good in terms of performance management, and it doesn't happen that way. That it literally is one part of this larger process, this larger initiative you need to undertake, and everything from helping people understand why they're using this data system and why you need to enter data in a certain way, all the way to the usability of the system, and once you get the information out of the system, what do you actually do with it, and how do you use it to make important decisions?
Right, and as somebody representing Social Solutions here, I'd like to just echo that what we have seen in our experience is that people, they get the ETO software and it is just a tool, and the most overlooked part of it is that culture change that we're talking about today. So this is a very important topic, I think. And I'd like to move on to something a little bit different. We have a question from a funder who would love to hear more about Julie's perspective on the difference in tracking outcomes as a funder versus a service provider. So this is a question that often comes up. How do we account for outcomes we are only partially responsible for?
Yes. So as a service provider, as I mentioned, we used ETO to track our data, to track our outcomes and indicators and put our measures in the system. We looked at actually a lot of outcomes and indicators that as a funder we are looking at. So at the service provider level, we were looking at participant level outcomes. So the clients that we served, we were tracking and measuring that. As a funder, what we're looking at is more aggregated outcomes and indicators. And we just got I believe our second set of outcome reports from our providers. And what we've done, what we did from the very start was, and this was what we did during our Theory of Change process with Dr. David Hunter, is predefine our outcomes and indicators and some measures for what we fund. And I will tell you, prior to coming to the Children's Service Fund, I was at another funder, the United Way, and it was very challenging when some of those outcomes and indicators weren't predefined because there was still a lot of confusion about what is an outcome, what is an indicator. A lot of the stuff that we got were really outputs and inputs and staff training hours and things like that. And so as a funder, we couldn't compare apples to apples. We really couldn't aggregate anything. So that was a lesson that I had learned there. And then coming to the Children's Service Fund, we really predefined them, kept it simple. We have 3 overall outcome areas where we look at improved functioning, we look at improved well-being, and then we look at symptomatology. And under each of those outcome areas, we have specific indicators that agencies select. And these are typical indicators for children's mental health and substance abuse services. So, we have a very targeted service area of funding, and that's due to our state statute that we're based off of. So as a funder, we're able to aggregate that information much easier now that it's predefined, and we're still learning, and we're still kind of figuring that out. We just got our reports in, and really, we look at the individual agency level reports, and then we aggregate it, and then we use at that individual level, use that as a way to, you know, talk with the agencies and engage with them in a conversation about, you know, how to improve those areas. And then we also provide learning work groups around those topics.
Okay, and Julie, what's your website so people can take a look at that?
Yeah, it's keepingkidsfirst.org.
Okay, great. Here we have another sort of big question. Is there any potential to make performance management a standard in public serving government agencies? As a social service nonprofit, we are held to the highest standards by funders, and yet as a consultant to juvenile justice system agencies, I see in my day-to-day work how completely unaccountable and low-performing the most critical social services agencies are that have the largest government funding pots. Could performance management ever be translated into legislation to hold our public serving agencies accountable to a minimum standard and effort to improve? You may both want to comment on that. You want to start, Isaac?
Sure. So that's a big question, yes. But I'm glad you asked it, because I do think the answer is yes. But I think it's going to take a lot of work. I mean, what we're talking here about is we're talking not even just a culture change within an organization now. We're talking a culture change within an entire industry or part of or the government itself. But I think it's more than the government. I think that there's a culture change that needs to happen within funders and foundations and nonprofit institutions, and even amongst you know, the general public and recipients of services. And I think something has to happen on a large scale, and there needs to be large public sentiment and support for something like that to happen, and for the laws or legislations to be implemented to make sure that it actually does get put into place. Now, saying all that, it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of buy-in from, you know, millions of people. Can it be done? I think it can. And the example I often point to is 100 years ago, when sort of the area of philanthropy was first getting started, when people were giving donations or providing funding or money for philanthropic purposes, no one ever thought to do things like check or validate or make sure every one of the organizations they gave money to had strong financial management practices. So there was nothing like 990 forms or anything where people would examine how good a nonprofit was in terms of using their finances. It just wasn't thought about 100 years ago. Now, fast forward to today, and any funder, the first thing they're going to check when they're looking or thinking about giving money in any substantial amount to a nonprofit organization is to look at their financial status and see if the organization is financially stable. Now, we just need something to happen at that scale and with the level of definition and standardization for performance management and for the use of outcome information on that larger scale, and to shift that thinking to that direction. Will it take 100 years? I certainly hope not, but it will take a large kind of cultural and awareness change within millions of people, literally millions of people, to put enough pressure on government institutions and entities to make sure that that does happen. Now, are there government entities and institutions at the smaller scale, so certainly not the federal, but the local level, that have really taken this to heart and have made changes? Absolutely. So you see it in multiple cities across the country, but I think right now it's only at the very city or local level, and hopefully it'll trickle up to the state and the federal levels as more and more people recognize the importance of what performance management can do.
Yeah, I agree with Isaac. I mean, that's a great question, and I think it's possible, but it's going to take some time and some intentionality and some leadership. Yeah.
Okay, and we have a few more minutes, so we'll take a few more questions here. We have a question about in a situation where an organization seems to be static in practice and one has all these creative abilities and even knowledge to promote such skills of performance management, yet they don't seem to embrace your ideas. How can you get around that to make it work? Now, that's a real culture question, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of the way of kind of confronting that is really to see if you can collect information or to bring up an instance that's really going to be an eye-opener for the organization. And I think what I often encourage people to think about in those sorts of situations is to actually see if you can determine or collect information to prove that your organization has caused harm to participants. So if you're already collecting some sort of information but people don't recognize the importance of using it, if you can actually find evidence within your organization that things have gone the opposite direction that you've intended or you've actually caused harm to participants, that's a huge eye-opener to organizations, to leadership within the organization to really say, look, we have the best of intentions and we think everything is going well, but when I just looked at this little bit of information, it shows that we're actually making things worse. And oftentimes that's the critical part for getting people to sit up and understand the importance of doing this work. I think another way, and you know, I'm curious to hear what Julie would think of this, is to see what the funding community around you is saying about this, or what your peer organizations or competitor organizations are doing around this work as well. So if you can see that an organization up the street or organizations you tend to compete against for grant monies are already down this road and already sort of undertaking this journey, then you're behind as an organization. And if you don't start to catch up now, you're only going to fall farther and farther behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that we do here is what we call learning work groups. And so what we do is we bring our funded partners together at least once a month to share knowledge, to share best practices, and also to learn from one another. You know, what we're trying to do is really to create a system of care here and have a real collaborative model. And so while the agencies may be competing with one another for donor dollars and funder dollars, at the end of the day, we all just want to improve the lives of the people that we serve. And so these learning work groups have been a really great way for our agencies to share best practices and learn from one another.
Okay, and we have 2 minutes left, so I'll take one last question, which is whether you two can speak a little bit to the importance of complementing performance measurement with true evaluation.
Really good question. Julie, you want to start or do you want me to?
You go ahead. I had a hard time hearing the question.
Okay.
It was a little echo.
So the question was how to get performance management, performance measurement, and evaluation, and how can you complement, or how are they complementary? So I do think that they're two slightly distinct concepts that have many similar approaches that are very much complementary. And so the way sort of I think about it, or the way I encourage organizations to think about this, is performance management is what you're doing to prove to yourself that your programming is effective and that it is working, so that you can make changes to make sure that it is working better down the road. Evaluation is ultimately what you'd want to do to be able to prove that your programming is effective to outsiders or to someone else. Now, before you can prove it to someone else or prove it to outsiders, you need to know if it's working, you know, at all first. And I think that's the performance management aspect of it. You use performance management techniques to actually show if it's working, and if it's not working, how you can make improvements to the point where it is working and you're getting good outcomes. At some point, when you've been operating for a while, or you've done performance management for a while, and you're consistently getting good outcomes, then you can move to formal evaluation techniques where you can then collect information and do analyses to demonstrate the effectiveness of your work to outsiders. That oftentimes means a higher level of rigor. It often means bringing in an outside group to have a more objective analysis and of your information and data, and it's also more of a resource investment and a time investment on your part. So I think that they certainly flow into each other. I think good performance management techniques and processes set you up to be able to do a really good and high quality evaluation, and a lot of the techniques and processes are very similar. I think ultimately it's just why you're collecting the information and ultimately what it's going to be used for. Are you using it to prove to yourself that things are working, or are you using it to prove to outsiders that it's working, and the level of time and commitment and resources you're willing to commit to be able to do it.
And there's a very good little research brief from Charles Ernst called Performance Management and Evaluation. What's the difference?
Right,
that's,
exactly.
On the Performo website and on Charles Ernst's website, obviously. So that's something you can Google if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Julie, did you want to comment on that?
No, I agree with Isaac said, yep, and I think that article is great too.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we are at 4:31, and we are going to end the webinar here. And I would like to thank you, Isaac and Julie, so much for being on this webinar and staying longer. We have been through almost all of the questions we got, and we'll have to apologize to those of you who sent questions we were not able to answer, but we will do our best again next time to stay a little bit longer. So thank you very much to our audience.